Hi everybody, and welcome to the July meeting for the Sydney City Bonsai Club. We've got a very exciting program, including a very good presenter this month, and that is Evan Marsh, and I'll hand over to him now.
I'll give a little background about myself for all those who probably don't know me. There's a few familiar faces I know around the room, but yeah, I've been involved in the Sydney Bonsai scene for quite a while now, probably close to 12 years. And I, like tonight, do demonstrations for most of the other clubs as well. So my background is I'm also a horticultural scientist. So I work for the garden company Yates, where I do product development for them. So I design new fertilizers, new plant sprays. And adjacent to that, I've had extensive bonsai training. So I spent close to about 11 months in Japan over a few trips, predominantly with one teacher, which was Koji Hiromatsu. So he's a pine specialist, particularly a shohin pine and juniper specialist. But where he's based in the town Takamatsu in Japan is a very large, probably the largest pine production area for bonsai pines. So I think they're producing and growing about 80% of the black pine, white pine that is sold and available from Japan. And one of the great things about studying there is it's not just sort of one or two nurseries, there's about 50 or 60 nurseries in the area. And they deal in all stages of production. So there are nurseries that really just specialise in stock like this, where they'll be propagating, they'll be grafting varieties, but all they do is that sort of first 1, 2 or 3 years of growth of the tree, and then moves on to the next guy who starts to actually grow the tree into a bonsai, and then this will go to another guy who will do the refinement side of things, and then sometimes another guy, an exporter. But yeah, every single step of the bonsai making process is happening within this village. And as a result, it means I got to see hands-on every single step of the process of how they're growing, making trees, refining trees. So I'll basically talk about my methods that I've developed from my study trips, from a bit of trial and error over the years. And I'll talk through all of those. And also while I'm talking, please, if you have any questions, please just raise your hand or ask me in a moment, and I'm happy to answer them rather than come back to them at the end. So all good, everyone? We'll get started. So I'll just arrange some of these trees to make sure as we talk. I'll give a little background about myself for all those who probably don't know me. There's a few familiar faces I know around the room, but yeah, I've been involved in the Sydney Bonsai scene for quite a while now, probably close to 12 years. And I, like tonight, do demonstrations for most of the other clubs as well. So my background is I'm also a horticultural scientist. So I work for the garden company Yates, where I do product development for them. So I design new fertilizers, new plant sprays. And adjacent to that, I've had extensive bonsai training. So I spent close to about 11 months in Japan over a few trips, predominantly with one teacher, which was Koji Hiromatsu. So he's a pine specialist, particularly a shohin pine and juniper specialist. But where he's based in the town Takamatsu in Japan is a very large, probably the largest pine production area for bonsai pines. So I think they're producing and growing about 80% of the black pine, white pine that is sold and available from Japan. And one of the great things about studying there is it's not just sort of one or two nurseries, there's about 50 or 60 nurseries in the area. And they deal in all stages of production. So there are nurseries that really just specialise in stock like this, where they'll be propagating, they'll be grafting varieties, but all they do is that sort of first 1, 2 or 3 years of growth of the tree, and then moves on to the next guy who starts to actually grow the tree into a bonsai, and then this will go to another guy who will do the refinement side of things, and then sometimes another guy, an exporter. But yeah, every single step of the bonsai making process is happening within this village. And as a result, it means I got to see hands-on every single step of the process of how they're growing, making trees, refining trees. So I'll basically talk about my methods that I've developed from my study trips, from a bit of trial and error over the years. And I'll talk through all of those. And also while I'm talking, please, if you have any questions, please just raise your hand or ask me in a moment, and I'm happy to answer them rather than come back to them at the end. So all good, everyone? We'll get started. So I'll just arrange some of these trees to make sure as we talk. Growth on these. Just these, you can do it 10 times quicker, and then it's twice as effective and easier to manage. So this tree I've been growing probably close to 9 or 10 years at this point. And when I started, it was a small seedling stock like this. So it was only about about 2 years when I started growing it. And this tree, while it's looking good, there's lots of mistakes that I should have done when I initially started. I sort of regret now after knowing what I know. But as you can see, through that 8 to 9 year growing process, the one thing that's kept growing that I haven't cut out all is the sacrifice branch. So for me, growing conifers involves utilising a lot of sacrifice branches, and particularly ones that you won't cut until the tree is about 80% of the thickness that you want. So the one thing my teacher taught me was, you get the tree to 80% thickness, you cut the sacrifice off at that point, and that extra 20% of thickness comes as the tree is around 5 is defined, and it's just, the component just takes time naturally to do. So when this tree, even at this point, I'm still not happy with the thickness of this tree, so I'm probably going to leave this another 5 or 6 years if I can. But yeah, to get to that 8 years, I've achieved that sort of thickness, which was comparative to this tree. So this tree is a little bit older, it's probably about 14 years. And this one, it's achieved that sort of similar growth rate in the same amount of time. Question.
How long has it been in that pot?
So that's a really, really good question, which sort of leads into the next part we'll talk about, which is this tree's been in this pot for 6 to 7 years without repotting. So one of the things with growing conifers is if you repot them often throughout the process, it slows down growth, actually slows down the thickening. So the strategy with conifers is when you grow them, you leave them in that pot for as long as possible. And sometimes that can involve 5, 10, 15, maybe not 20 years, you probably repot at that point, but the longer you can leave it, the less stress it is to the tree. Because the moment you repot conifers, they tend to slow down a lot for the year following the repot, depending on how harsh the repot is. So the idea is if you can get away with not repotting them, that's the best outcome, because it means you can put all the strength into thickening the tree, and then when it's ready, you can slow the tree down, and then focus on the repot into the smaller pot. So I might just take a few steps back, and we'll just talk about sort of the starting point of the stock or the smaller material like this. So these seedlings here are about 2 years old from seed. One of the most important things for pines that I've come to really try and focus on those first few years, because once they're set in, you can't change them, is the nabari of the roots. For a pine, it's impossible, maybe possible sometimes, but most of the time impossible to change the outcome of the nabari after that first 2 or 3 years of development. That's how long we're talking. Like all of this that you see set here was done in that initial 2 or 3 years of establishment. So the focus that I put onto seedling stock, so I started these from seed, when they were about this big, and grow a little bit longer, maybe to about half the height of this. I focused on repotting all of those seedlings and either trimming roots to try and get more roots to grow and encourage more proliferation of roots, and focus to actually spread those roots flat and sort of uniform. So this whole tray here that you see, plus all the 100 others I've got in my backyard, I individually had each seedling and teased out roots with a chopstick or some tweezers to make sure they're exactly where I wanted them, potted them up, and then let them grow for the next year or two. So just that simple act of placing roots exactly where you want it makes a world of difference. So I've got trees, so most of the ones I developed ended up with quite good nabaris. This one here might be a bit hard to notice from the back, but you can see these two little stubby dead roots here. So that was my result of spreading the nabari, and what's happened is the tree actually fell over maybe a year or two ago. And as a result, I actually lost some roots that were originally, if this tree was rotated back into its original orientation, would have made a good nabari. As a result, I only really have those 2 roots that come out from the front, and I'm not really going to get any nabari on that front side at all. So the material's still good, but it's already defective. And this tree is only about 4 years old from seedling. So even in that early stage, it can be make or break whether you keep a tree or you just reject it and say it's not worth pursuing. It just comes down to those little minuscule millimeter thick roots, how you place those. So that's the first focus, is roots. And after that, I don't do anything for the trees, I just sort of let them grow. Because the idea is that the year after, I will come through and start doing the bending process. So this one here is probably actually about the same age as this one, but it's a little bit further along. Further along this, so in between this and this. So the next step is obviously to build bends in the trunk. So one thing, and this is one of my big regrets for this stock here, is I never bent this tree. I just let it grow straight. As a result, I've got a straight tree. When I put movement into it, at this thickness, I can't. It's near impossible. The only option is to cut things, maybe try and make the tree a bit more asymmetrical in its design, or keep it as an upright tree, such as this one here. The thing with pines is when they get to a certain thickness, it's actually very difficult to get meaningful bends into them. So we've got two bits of stock that are quite similar. One's a little bit further along. It's missing a bunch of needles as well. Yeah, this is still quite flexible, but I wouldn't be able to get the severe bends that I've got with this piece of stock here without maybe risking the health of the tree through some breakage, through some sap leakage. So even at this point, this is starting to get a little bit too thick for a small show-in tree, but potentially if I wanted to develop a larger tree, I can still use stock like this. So essentially a good point I've just realised I've mentioned is the height of what your tree is important to actually set very early on as well. So this tree here was always intended to be a show-in tree. And you can see that through the final foliage that I've got here, a little bit of sacrifice to help put these things up. But the fact that all of this growth up to the sacrifice at the top is bare with needles. So one important thing with pine seedlings in particular is the moment that you start to get bare needles, you start to lose the potential for buds to actually develop. So this tree here, it's still young, it's still only maybe 2 or 3 years old. There is a potential to get buds, but not as much as if I had left it like this one here. So one thing to remember with pines is that every single needle pair, so I'll just pull one out here. So every single little pair of needles you have on the black pine, and this also, the case is true for white pine as well, with those 5 little clusters. There's actually a potential for a bud right at the sheath down here, right in between the base of those 2 needles. Inside the sheath is an undeveloped bud. If we pull all these needles off, like what's happened here, and actually pluck the tree, we're just losing buds every time we pluck. If we try and leave as many needles as we can, that means we have that many potential buds developing in the future. So if you maintain growth where you want to keep future branches by leaving needles, it guarantees that you get branches where you need to build a tree. If you pluck too many things, then obviously, it's very difficult to develop branches low. For a show-in tree that's only 20 centimetres tall, so it's about that span there. I have 2 bits of growth within that 20 centimetres span. That's essentially useless for a show-in. If you can see how many branches this tree has, within, it's a bit taller than 20, but within that span, I have maybe sort of 10 or 12 branches all up and down the trunk. So again, it's about keeping as many possible branches as you can for future development. You might not know what that future looks like yet, but you've got the potential there by just leaving needles. So important things to note, so leaving needles, developing roots. Point out as well, now we'll talk about substrate. So all of these trees, every single pine and most of the conifers, most of the junipers on this table, are all grown in substrate that has longevity to it. So I primarily use scoria as my substrate, in a very particular size, so about 3 to 5 mil. And what benefits scoria has over potting mix or other sort of organic media is it doesn't break down. We talked about growing trees for long stretches in the same pot. The last thing we want is the soil to break down over that 10 or maybe 15 year period, because breakdown equals too much water, which equals rot, which equals slowing the tree health, maybe potentially death. So having a substrate that won't break down over that 10 years is crucial, to the point where I grow these trees in 100% scoria, with nothing else. There's no organics, there's no clay, it's just pure scoria. But the good thing about black pines is they can handle that sort of media. They're trees that in nature grow by the ocean. They are coastal trees. They're used to sandy environments. And as a result, they can actually grow quite healthily in very sort of nutrient deficient soils, provided we can keep supplying them nutrition throughout the process. So one thing about all my trees is I have to make sure I fertilise them very regularly during the growing season. Otherwise, there's just not enough nutrition naturally in the soil for the tree to actually develop. So soil is very important, keeping them in that very gritty media. What that also helps to do is develop roots closer to the trunk. So gritty media not breaking down. If you've ever used scoria or other similar mixes, you can develop really fine roots throughout the entire media due to the size of it. So one thing question?
So will those pines stay in that size pot now for a long time? Or are they really?
Yeah, I'll come back to that question after this point. So, so the fine media in that sort of gravel in that 2 to 5 millimeter size allows you to develop a lot of really fine roots throughout the entire pot, not just around the surface edges or maybe towards the surface, but yeah, just throughout the entire media, which comes in handy when it comes time to actually put them into smaller pots like this. So here's, I guess, the next point. If we use organics, you tend to get roots that go straight up to the edge, and then they start spinning around. If you try and pick a tree that has a root system like that, this will pot like this. You spend a lot of time trying to actually develop roots closer and closer to the base, sometimes to the point where you can't get them into pots this small, because there are no roots close to them already. The good thing I like about this particular inorganic media, this size, is I can easily repot from this pot into this pot in one season, because I just have fine roots throughout the entire piece, even after a very long period, such as 8 to 10 years. In fact, I just did one the other year where I went from this size pot down to this size pot, just a single repot without any issues. So, to your point about, can this tree stay in this pot, or will it stay in this pot for the next 10 years? That's the next important step. Is for conifers, pot size really dictates how quickly the thickening of the tree will occur. So I think I've brought these two in as an example because these two trees are actually the exact same age. The only difference is this one was potted up in a much larger pot. And as a result, able to put a lot more root mass. This one, within maybe a year or two, is already, you can see it down there, it's already filled the pot to the point where the mycorrhiza just grow out the bottom. This pot, for instance, there's still a lot of space in the pot. It hasn't proliferated all throughout the pot. It's got enough room where it can put on a lot of root mass, which again contributes to that thickening. So, yeah, the size really does dictate how thick the tree will get. If you want to try and develop really small trees, if you put them in too large of a pot, they'll actually grow too quickly to the point where you might lose some of the characteristics, such as that nice gradual taper that you want in a really small tree, or even you might lose some of this branching that you need to use for the future. So really kind of think about what size you want the tree from the time that you wire it when it's at this stage is very important. If you're not thinking about the final size of the tree, the final size dictates where you'll put the sacrifice, where you'll place the branching, what you'll keep. Because that image for the future is so important. Cool. So any questions about that?
You said that using organic soil tends to get the roots to grow out to the extremities. What is it horticulturally about organic soil that makes them do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's all about water and air relationship. So obviously organic soil holds a lot more water in it. For trees, they don't actually like water. There's sort of this Goldilocks zone that trees will grow perfectly in. It's like a 50-50 balance of air to water. What happens with inorganic medias is they reach that Goldilocks zone a lot quicker. Like the moment you water them, they lose a lot of that water. They're almost immediately in that nice 50-50 ratio. The downside is they dry out a bit quicker. They go towards that 0 point and then we water them again and they go back up again. Organic soils need to dry out a bit before they reach that sort of nice Goldilocks zone. So what happens there is with water, it might take a few hours, it might take a whole day before it then reaches that period of perfect growth. It stays in that for a relatively long time and then will slowly work its way to zero. The problem with that is inconsistency as well in organics. If you mix organics with inorganics, you get pockets of moisture, which means you'll get areas where you'll get good root growth, areas with bad root growth. But it's really about how long can you stay in that nice Goldilocks zone for. With inorganics, you have more control. So one thing I like to say is it's easy to put water in, it's very difficult to take water out. With organic soils, if I put water in, it might be a week sometimes before I have to wait for the next watering. Particularly during winter, it can be like a week or two before you start to see things dry out. Obviously, it's impossible to remove the water to sort of accommodate for that, which is when inorganics become a lot easier because you can manage the water relationship much easier. Like I said, it's much easier to give water. So with inorganic soil, maybe every 2 days in the winter. It's growing out to the point I need to rewater. But I'm not having the issue of having too much water, which is more detrimental than not having enough water. It just means the trade-off is during the summertime, I might have to water 2 or 3. If they're very small pots, 4 times a day potentially. But there are other ways to manage so that's not occurring. But yeah, it's really about staying in that nice water to air ratio where it's just the length of time you can stay in that, or the length of time you can get back to that constantly. Does that sort of make sense? If you get a projector and you have to exact, I've got a whole talk about soils and soil science. But yeah, for conifers in particular, they like to be on the drier side. So I did mention black pines and coastal trees in nature. In Japan, they grow on the islands, they grow right next to the beach. So they're used to having that bit of dry, because obviously sand does not hold much moisture. I'm sure there's salt water, there's other things happening, but yeah, they're used to being on the drier side, so we can get away with letting them get it dry before they go. And too wet, they'll just start to rot. So the main reason I prefer this over inorganics is because organic stays too wet. The other benefit with this is it also allows me to basically over-fertilize these during the season. So you can never over-fertilize them to the point where they're dying, because there's nothing to really hold the nutrition in the soil. So I can constantly give them liquid fertilizer without any sort of detriment occurring, maybe some salt buildup if I'm not careful. But yeah, the rate at which I can apply water and fertilizer is unlimited to this soil compared to organics. I'm just trying to think where we're at in terms of the story. So we're talking about the height. So one thing, we have to lock in what height when we wire this tree essentially. So all of the bending that we do in the trunk, so like I said before, I regretted not bending this one. As you can see, I've taken a very different approach to this tree and actually bent it a lot. One thing with pines is a lot of the taper you see developed is either through age, where the tree is just that old, it's not that thick, and it's been cut multiple times, or for shogun trees in particular, you can develop fake taper. So it's taper achieved through bending as opposed to trying to thicken certain sections and keep other sections thinner. And the way we do that is, I'll bring some wire here just to show you, is we basically double the trunk back down into itself. So you can imagine if we've got, actually we'll do this wire instead. So imagine this is the trunk here. And the skinny bit of wire is our seedling. If I put the trunk next to itself, and these thicken up and join in the middle, immediately the trunk has become twice as thick as it was. If I then have a section that goes above it by itself, immediately we've got, you can see that, thick taper to thin taper, without doing any work really, without having to wait for time to catch up. And we can achieve this through bonsai stock as well. So if I wire this in a certain way, I can make the bottom double up or get thicker twice as quick as the top through deception. It looks thicker, it's not actually thicker. It's all the same thickness. It just so happens they've been wired close enough where they meet in the middle once they get to this thickness, and the gap closes, and immediately the tree is twice as thick at the bottom compared to the top. So we achieve that, like I said, just through wiring down, so across, and then back up. So imagine this is our soil level. That's what we're going to do to the tree. We're going to wire it in this sort of S shape. If I rotate that forwards, it almost comes into a circle before it goes back up again. So the idea is, we're developing that fake sense of taper through the way we position this trunk. But also, imagining this is the shogun tree like this one, where that sacrifice goes to and where it comes up really dictates how big the tree is. So if we say, for instance, have a nice little tree that's this tall, the loop only needs to be this big. If we go for a much larger tree, if it's a tree that's suddenly this tall, the loop needs to be much wider to actually accommodate for that. So that loop and where we have our branches sort of relative to the loop, because ideally we want the branches to be sitting right on top of where that loop is sort of wide. So then we can wire those branches down and hide the fact that it is fake taper. But like I said before, we need needles in that section above where the bend has occurred. So as a result, you want stock, or you want to choose stock that has needles where you'll have the top of that bend occurring. So I'll show you what that means. So again, the important thing I said before, we're focusing on the roots for that first year. It develops the Nabari, but allows us to do this bending that I'm doing now. because we want the tree to be strong and healthy and actually have quite a good foundation to it before we can expand.
So is that the right age for bending now, or you would have waited a little bit longer?
Yeah, this is probably the right age here.
Yeah.
This sort of thickness is good. Again, this can still work, but like I said, we're limited with how much we can bend. I don't actually want to go much further than that. It feels like it's going to snap. Whereas with this tree here, I can bend. I'll get a really skinny one. I can bend it quite easily, almost back onto itself without
More
issue.
flexible.
Yeah, they're more flexible. So it really depends on how big you want the tree. Because this tree, for instance, if I grow it as a much larger tree, I don't need the bends to be as harsh either. They can be quite gentle. They can go thicker than this before I bent it. But to develop a really, so let's try and say for now, we'll actually try and develop this as a 20 centimetre high shading tree. So we don't need the bends to be, we do need the bends to be very tight to actually achieve that 20 centimetre height. So the one thing with shading bonsais is adhering to this 20 centimetres means we've only got that much space to build a trunk and build branches on top of it. So if we imagine this is the height of the tree, ideally we want half of that to be the thick part of the tree and the other half to be the branches that come down. So we've got 10 centimetres where we need to bend this tree down, sort of parallel to the ground, back up again, and then have enough branching that sits on top of that to then build the branches, much like this one here in future. So this is why, I guess, there's a lot of debate around how tall or how big the shading should be. Some people say 25. I adhere to the 20, which is what the Shading Association specifies.
Did they change the sizes last year or something? There's some changes happening?
Oh, I've been talking about it for about more than a decade now. But yeah, the reason why it's good is because it helps other parts of the chain, such as bonsai growers, if they know how big a shading tree should be. It helps when they're starting the process so they can make that tree to be 20 centimeters to be that shading size. It also helps stand makers because 20 centimeter trees need stands of a certain size to match the scale of the trees. Suddenly the tallest trees can suddenly be 25 centimeters. There's no stands around to actually accommodate that size. People have to make new stands. So yeah, part of that 20 centimeter adhering to that, I think it's crucial to keep it at 20 because everything is built around 20. The pot sizes, the stand sizes, the trees. It's come about because the best trees that are exactly 20 centimeters are now just starting to creep above that size. So hence why the push for people that own those trees to want the size to increase because otherwise their trees aren't shrinking. So, okay, so you can see that I've put some not too thick wire, thick enough to bend this. And what I'll do is try and get this point maybe down to that sort of height, just purely through how I bend it. So, always important to try and bend the tree with the same direction as you place the wire, particularly in this instance, because we need to get as much strength as we can on this wire to hold.
And I can see on these ones, did you leave the wire there? The wire, see the wire?
For some of them I did, not intentionally.
Okay, but maybe just as a little bit of character to start cutting.
Yeah, so much to James's point, it's actually a legitimate technique to allow the wire to cut in. So in this instance, what you can see here is it's helped to thicken the tree much quicker, because obviously the tree's had to grow around the wire, where it's growing around the wire, so it produces a lot more cambium tissue, because obviously it's almost like it's being hurt in that instance, so it's trying to grow around the wire at that point. But what you can also do is to get very thin, so this is a technique they use a lot in the growing areas, where you get the thinnest copper wire possible and actually tighten it to basically constrict the bark and force it to scar up. When it starts to build that scar tissue, they then take that wire off. And they do that repetitively sort of every year for the next 10 years. And as a result, the tree does actually thicken a little quicker. And because they're pines and they do start to develop flaky bark, most of that scarring is sort of hidden below the bark or in between the bark, and you can't see it as a result. That's more for the mass-produced trees where they do that. The very top quality shohin, they don't tend to actually do that because it's noticeable. It doesn't produce a beautiful sort of elegant result. It is a very brutal sort of look to the tree's bark and its characteristic. So yeah, I've employed it sometimes, but I find it's better to actually not allow it to cut. I think you get a much better result if you don't do that, at the detriment of speed, of course. But I think with the right proper setup, we'll talk a bit about sacrifice setup as well. But if we set things up properly, you don't need to rely on techniques like that through the other techniques we've worked on. So, okay, so I'll go back to that tree up again. So with the goal in mind, it's going to be a nice little show here. It can be a much shorter tree. I have twisted, quite happy with that. Twisted a little bit. Okay, so I've twisted this tree, as you can see, that's really quite parallel to the ground. And then, top section a bit more. So the idea is it should go parallel to the ground, so sweep up and then cut across. So the idea is once this thickens up and meets in the middle, it will suddenly start to look thicker straight away from that fake taper. The other thing we can do is actually bend it down towards the ground. So even though we don't have an nabari on this side, when it does thicken up, it almost fuses and looks like there is a nabari. There isn't really anything, but gives the fake deception that there is something there. And as a result, we've also reduced all those needles down to this part here. So that means that as this tree develops, we might get some branching or some future, like we've done there, some future sacrifices we can develop to become the apex in future. And the other thing I'll do is, at least for now, start to focus on this sacrifice branch. So you can see here I've got 1, 2, 3 bits of growth. I don't need that much growth at this point in time. So I'm actually going to take out the strongest, or the second strongest one, leave the weakest one here, keep the strong one, which is going to become my main sacrifice, and then leave all of the needles. Because as I said before, the needles are where the future branches will come from. So if I pluck any of these out, I'm going to lose all that branching potential. But what I want to do is actually try and get light onto the inside, because that will help tiny buds hopefully develop soon. So as a result, I can also, to get light inside, I can simply just cut the needles down to the length I want. So quickly, so cutting needles is fine if you're not showing a tree anytime soon. This tree here, I've cut the needles intentionally because it was getting a little bit too overgrown and a bit too full. But the idea is I'm not going to show this tree this year at all because it does look ugly when you get the little browning tip when the needles have been cut. But what it does is it's a very quick way to balance foliage without actually pulling too many needles off. So this is what I've done here. I balance the foliage to get a little bit more light into the interior, reducing the vigor of this area down here. So I don't want this bottom getting too strong. I want to focus all my energy to this top because that will help do thickening. But I still want enough energy for it to try and develop buds. So this tree, for instance, here, during the growing process, retained basically all of the branching that you see here, but in a very weak state. The idea is as long as I keep getting sun on that, those buds will remain alive, but they won't grow out and be strong like the sacrifice at the top. Obviously getting light to there is very important. How do we do that when we've got a sacrifice? It's about building a separation. So and you can see it done over multiple seasons here. I've actually plucked the needles in between where the sacrifice is and where the bottom is, the section I want to keep. And simply what that's doing is getting energy to both those areas. One's thickening, one's retaining buds. If I let this get too shaded, I'll start to lose those needles and then I lose the potential buds. So ideally, the goal is to never let this get shaded from this point on. Otherwise, I start to potentially lose the entire tree. One other thing that we can do to assist in that, so obviously, the way pines grow, they'll put out one bud, they might put out 3 or 4 buds, but yeah, they will tend to branch at junctions. We don't want that happening because the moment it starts to branch, it starts to, the branches go laterally and they start to shade out bottom areas, the same result. We want to just keep one bud that goes straight up. The idea is that gives us a decent amount of growth. If we keep the strongest bud, it gives us the strongest amount of growth without compromising the rest of the tree down the line. So we're actually going to go through and cut out and reduce any of the additional buds and just leave them on. So for instance, if this was a tree and let's not bother wiring this tree, let's just have this nice little short tree this tall. If we want to develop a short tree, say going up to this height, we can actually start to pluck all of this and just leave the top. So you can see building that separation is all about removing needles, which, like I said before, is removing potential bugs. We just want the singular bud as well. Does that make any sense to everyone? What I'm talking about here?
Cutting those needles, does that affect the health of that tree? Like, does that stop it? Like, does it affect it a little bit? Does it slow it down? Or does it remain just as it is?
Yeah, so anytime we do anything to needles, whether that's remove needles, cut needles, we're reducing the solar panels on that tree. You can't produce as much energy as a result. So for our benefits, we're using this to control the growth by weakening things. But yeah, cutting off half of these needles is half the amount of energy that tree produces in that area. Same result as pulling. If I have that, this is a good example, this whole area here, that suddenly had half of its energy removed because I've removed half of the needles and it's kept it on. So yeah, anytime you do pull off like needles, it reduces the amount of energy a tree can produce through photosynthesis. So it's about carefully managing it enough to the point where the tree can stay healthy and thicken, but doesn't compromise those other aspects we want, which is retaining buds low, strong growth at the top. Cool. So that is this tree setup now. So we've covered the root base, the Navari, that's been developed already within the first few years. We've bent the trunk in a way that will encourage it to develop sort of fake taper during the growing process. Still not happy with this one. Slightly over a bit more, it's better. Now it's sort of, what do we do from this point on? So keeping this as a very small tree means we don't want to put it into a very large pot. Trees can get too thick, but particularly sugar trees. There's a few around where they're 20 centimeters tall, but they're maybe 20, almost 30 centimeters wide. They just start to look a little bit too silly, and the pots get too wide as well. So we can't let the tree get too thick, and we don't want it to develop only 1 or 2 buds down the bottom, but as many as we can, 10, 15, 20, if we can. So if we put it into too large of a pot, that allows very vigorous growth, such as this one. We actually want to keep the growth contained on this, just a little bit, slow down the process, because it retains a lot more of the stuff that's useful when we develop the tree into a bonsai. So what I'll do is keep this in a slightly smaller pot, probably this size pot, use that scoria medium. So I'll go through, when I repot this, I'll actually tease out the roots. I won't just pop it in straight like this. We'll make sure the roots, which are probably coming down on the edge of the pot, are also going out straight now. Maybe shorten some of the very long ones. Put into this pot, and then from that point on, I'm not going to touch that. I'm not going to touch the roots on that tree for a good 5 or 6 years.
How long until you do that?
Probably straight away. If I went home tonight and felt like repotting, I'd pop this tree up tonight. So as soon as you can, once you do this process, you should repot it. If not, you can do this while repotting. Well, if you want to wire the tree and put movement in while you're repotting, that's perfectly fine at this point. So the idea is you put it into this pot, and we just start feeding this tree as much as we can.
And are these, when you're uppotting that, is that getting bare rooted in all new soil, or are you more than a little bit
For this age, I'm probably just going to bare root it. Pines you can bare root as long as you don't cut roots. There's a bit of a misconception where people think you can't bare root pines. I've been with some of the big guys who we've bare rooted pines that are this thick without cutting any roots, and they're fine. They can power on next season. So yeah. So the good thing about the scorious soil is it's very easy to bare root because you just shake the tree and all the soil will just
yeah. So do you keep that in that pot there for say 6 months, 5 months, and then transplant into a smaller pot, which is this terracotta one?
Yeah. That could be fine as well, but ideally at this time of year, it's the ideal time to repot and do work on black pine roots. So for me, timing of when you repot is the most important thing for all species. The pines, it should be just before that bud burst in spring, or for autumn is potentially another time. Outside of that window, so leaving this for 5 months or doesn't leave in summer, it's better just to wait another 5 months until following spring. The issue is if you wait that long, you've already lost a whole year's worth of growth. So the idea is, if you can do this work as soon as possible during this time of the year, it's ideal because it just leaves the entire season for the tree to grow. So the focus after repotting is 2 things. It's fertilizing and watering. So the good thing with this soil is, even in winter, I'm probably going to be watering this in the day, But after repotting, I'll wait a few weeks and then start fertilising immediately. And typically when I fertilise, I'm using chicken manure-based things like dynamic lifter or rooster booster in conjunction with liquids or slow or controlled release fertilisers. So while chicken manures are good, they're not strong enough to achieve this sort of growth on a plant. So you want to be supplementing that chicken manure with basically synthetic nitrates and urea and all really strong stuff that will power on trees, because they can suck up a lot of fertilizer in these trees. You can apply a lot of nitrogen throughout the season, and if you apply it even during winter, they'll just burst with growth in spring. So the focus is two things for the next 5 years: is constantly watering and constantly fertilizing. In between that, so the thing I like about growing pines is there's actually minimal work during the rest of the season. So all the work is done in winter. You touch the tree once a year, and outside of that, you might do a little bit of work in summer if the tree needs it, but most of the time you only work on once a year while they're growing. So the only work that I'd potentially do during the summer is actually starting to do candle cutting. So candle cutting, we know for refined trees, if we want to maintain the size of the needle size, buds, the density of the tree, we'll come through and do that candle cutting around Christmas. Candle cutting is sometimes needed on developing trees if the bottom section starts to get too vigorous. So if suddenly this has candles that are 20 centimeters long and the tree is just covered in growth, I want to actually slow down that section. If this tree is going to be 20 centimeters tall and has a candle that's 20 centimeters long, that's not needed as a branch. If I wire that down, it's immediately too far from the trunk. I want to try and keep this tree small and then to ramify it like this one. So what do I need to achieve growth like this? I need to candle cut and achieve lots of buds, as many as possible. So through candle cutting just the bottom section, I can maintain the future branching to eventually develop like this. Whereas the top, I'm not doing anything to it, apart from probably that process of knocking out all the weak buds and just leaving that one strong candle. So it might be a bit hard to see here, but basically the tallest candle is the one I'll keep, and probably right before spring, I should do this soon actually, I'll cut off all the other ones and just leave that one. So yeah, this process is something I'll just keep doing year on year on year as the tree develops until it hopefully reaches getting close to that, the base being as thick as I like. Then I'll start to wire out the branching and actually move the angle of the branching down, start to try and develop some branching to the point where once this tree is almost thick enough, the rest of the tree is already developed. So I'm sort of developing, I'm not having to spend extra years to ramify the tree, I'm developing this towards the end of the process. There's a few additional things you might want to thicken sections up, so you start doing section sacrifices. But it's really about, just waiting until you're happy with that thickness, which then starts the very last step in the process, which is the one that I think a lot of people do too quickly, and as a result actually kill trees. So you're trying to reduce a large amount of growth like this, on a small tree like this, done too quickly can actually cause dieback, and then maybe the death of the tree if you're unlucky, or large sections of maybe half the trunk dying back. So we want to avoid that, because obviously it's not worth spending 8, 9, 10 years growing a tree only for it to die. So we actually want to gradually weaken this section here. So sometimes when you're developing trees, this bottom section might be like 1/10 of the strength of the top section. If you cut out the very strong bit and only leave all the weakest buds, that's not enough for the tree to thrive and carry on. So what we do is we slowly weaken the section to try and let the bottom take over and become the stronger section instead. We do that by simply reducing. So if I cut out the majority of that large section and just leave a few little tiny buds here, that balances the strength. So these are almost on the same page, and hopefully this one can start to pick up in strength. So what I do is I weaken this, and when I notice this suddenly being a lot stronger than the top, I'll do the final cut, maybe leave a very long bit of dead sacrifice, which I then shorten off once this is fully taken over as the remaining tree. So that process can take a few years, sometimes 2 or 3 years, but the reduction should be slow, because if you give a tree with very strong roots and very weak buds, and the weak buds have to take over, usually they don't take over well, or they die in the process. Cool. Any more questions about pines?
My precursor in repotting, I've always thought you shouldn't repot bare root of pine. You were saying that's not an issue. What about the microcursor?
So Mycorrhiza are usually fine if you're bearing.
There's enough there.
Yeah, so there's two things to that, I guess. So bearing in pines requires the time of year. So if it's too hot, exposing the mycorrhiza to suddenly 30-degree air temperature, then that will be detrimental. We're used to the slightly colder environment of the soil, the slightly wetter environment of the soil, but also it can be a shock to the trees. So that repotting during now, so the weather's quite mild and dormant, that will be helpful for the mycorrhiza. If you know about mushrooms, they're actually starting to reproduce this time of year. It's called. They're sending up their sending up their little adult sort of fungal heads, producing spores. They're well adapted to getting work done at this time of year. The other thing, like you said, is even though we're taking out all the soil, there's still enough mycorrhiza left on the roots themselves. So mycorrhiza, the fungi actually penetrates into the root tissue. And as a result, they're doing their swap there, they're getting sugars, exchanging nutrients to the tree. But all of the root tips that you see will actually be covered in tiny bits of mycorrhiza. So, the tree will just slowly, you decimate the population in 90% of them are gone, 95% of them are gone. And it's just a matter of trying to provide things in the soil that will slowly cultivate them.
Can you, when you repot it, can you collect some of that mycorrhiza and put it back in the soil and you solve it, you think? Is that going to help?
You can. I don't think it's successful. Mycorrhiza have developed to purely have a relationship with. For pines, it's very noticeable. Most trees have some form of mycorrhiza present. The relationship is specific to that root to fungi relationship. So even if you're putting in mycorrhiza, they still have to go in and actually inoculate the root and start to develop and divide after that point. So it can be helpful to chuck old soil in, but I don't think there's a need to. They'll sort of naturally develop it. If you've got pines sitting next to other pines, sometimes you get mushrooms and the spores will actually start to spread between your pines naturally. You don't need to introduce it. So, the bird rooting, it's very detrimental, but it won't kill them.
Is there anything, can you chemically induce the mycorrhiza to grow back? By using something?
I bought some a couple of years ago. I'm not convinced that it was as good as natural mycorrhiza. You buy it, chemotherapy.
So you can get inoculants of mycorrhiza. The issue with mycorrhiza is that the strains or the species are the relationship to tree species is very specific. If it's not the right tree species, they actually won't take up divide in the soil. So pine mycorrhiza is specific to pines. It doesn't develop. So if you've ever had mushroom pine before, pine mushrooms. So that relationship is only related to pines. They don't grow on any other tree. So you can't just introduce any mycorrhiza, which is an issue with those mycorrhizal products because there might be certain species which can adapt to 80% of trees except for pines. Or it might be vice versa, there might be a pine-specific thing and they can't grow any other tree species. So you can buy blends that have a few different ones available, but it's not guaranteed that they'll take to that species. But to your point where it's can you chemically induce mycorrhiza to grow? Yes, you can, which is organic fertilizer. So things that mycorrhiza need are the one important thing for microbial populations is organic carbon, labile carbon that's sort of in an easily to consume form, which is what you get through adding chicken manure. You get carbon, you get a lot of carbon in a very easily already decomposted form. It's already been worked by microbes. They can be used by other microbes, and that's the best thing. And the reason why, even though I put these pretty heavy nitrogen fertilizers and these synthetics, is I make sure I put organics because that's feeding the soil, not the tree. So that's one important thing to remember is that a lot of the synthetic fertilizers are feeding the tree. Anything like chicken manure or compost, liquid compost is feeding the soil and the microbes, which we need for the tree to actually take up any nutrients at all. So organic compost throughout the process, manure is putting them on your tree. Worm weed as well, that works well. So it's using the best of both worlds. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about how do we reduce the root ball to fit into a pot like this? Pretty simple, to be honest. So we already talked about using the track soil from day one. You basically get a root hook and you rip into it. And the good thing is you can keep cutting and cutting, don't cut too far, but yeah, you can get down to a pretty small root ball. The good thing about this particular substrate is you still get really fine roots all the way close to that base, which I said you don't quite get in organic soil. It stays too wet near that base and all the roots go out to the edge where you get the warmth, plus you get the moisture, so the air flowing down the edge of the pot. So avoiding that by using a substrate that holds moisture evenly throughout the pot means, yeah, it's easy to get from this to this in one big pot. Okay, so we might finish talking about pines for tonight, and we'll talk a little bit about junipers. So these pine-specific techniques, we can utilise some of the components of pine growing. So obviously the thing like movement in the trunk, we can apply that to all pines. Bending them nice and tight so they start to fuse and meet in the middle and develop thickness. This trick of developing the fake taper, you can also use this on trident maples. Use it on pretty much anything where you want to develop a nice sumo base very quickly. The one thing that is slightly different with junipers is the way the trunks are developed. So the thing about pines is they'll thicken. They thicken quite easily, and if we get lucky, and most of the time, they sort of naturally develop taper through the way we place branches. Junipers, on the other hand, really scraggly things. You know, in nature, they're trees that will grow on cliff sides. They're adapted to very harsh environments, and as a result, they don't thicken the same way that regular trees do. They're quite sinuous in their form. They're almost like a or like a shrub when you see them there. Like I see the big trees, like the big Utah junipers, the ones sea junipers in the States. But a lot of junipers are quite small, close to cliffs, like you can see a lot of the cliffside melaleucas or pavilions here or something. But yeah, they're scraggly trees that don't thicken up in the same way. The question is, and this is Simon's tree, which is lovingly donated to me to use at the talk, is how do you develop a trunk like this on a juniper when they're just not designed to grow like that? And we talked a bit about that before through twisting. So the movement, and particularly the shari that you see in this tree, I can actually tell exactly how this tree was bent to grow like this. If we look at it from the back, that thickness from the base is truly how thick the tree is. It's only that sort of thickness. Whereas in the main section, it's almost twice as thick in some sections. And that's a result of how they've basically just bent the tree back on itself. Using this sort of same method where a tight bend, once it thickens to a certain point, will meet in the middle and suddenly becomes a solid wood. So to achieve this has been achieved by having the tree come up, bending it across, bending it back across, almost spaghettiing it into a big lump, and then using sacrifices, which you can see here are the genes now, to help thicken everything at this base. The same techniques apply again with having to keep and use this growth here. I can tell you with certainty these sacrifices used to be about this long in this tree. And growth has been maintained close to the trunk so that when this eventually becomes this, we've got enough growth to then wire this down and develop this. So through that same process, the good thing about junipers is they'll sort of naturally throw buds on the trunk and then they'll sort of branch out. And what we can do is we can wire the hell out of all that growth and try and get nice little tight curves with the intention of once these curves reach probably about the thickness of a 20-cent piece, everything will meet in the middle. This sinuous bunch of twisted trunks will just be one solid block of wood. We can't get thickening unless we keep sacrifices, so that's why we've got long bits. But like I said before, we have to keep as much as we can in the middle. So what we really do is if you're growing from cutting, you'll take the cutting, you'll wire it the first year, let it grow out, wire those extensions back in, and try and twist it up over a number of years. And once we're happy with how much growth we've got on the bottom, we can start to let things extend out and thicken up. Important again is if the tree is going to be, again, to show you that it's 20 centimeters tall, I don't need growth to be higher than this to become branching. But with that same dilemma, I don't want this to get too shaded by the things above it. So what we can start to do is reduce the amount of growth on this to let light in. And the good thing with junipers is all their strength still comes from these extensions. So as long as we have these extensions growing out, that's really what's feeding the tree down here. So with quite a lot of confidence and certainty, I can start to prune away some of these sacrifices. The good thing about junipers is you only need to do this pruning for maybe the first couple of years. Once this sacrifice basically maybe gets to this length, or in the instance of this one, grows out to stop shading the bottom section, I can just let it grow from that point onwards. As long as I've got this sort of big clear circle in the middle, where the light can penetrate in, that's all I really need for the tree. I just rely on this to keep extending out. The same thing again with junipers as with pines. If I put this into a much larger pot, it will develop a lot quicker. And for most junipers that I've seen, because juniper systems are quite fibrous, we can happily put them in very big pots and very easily cut them back compared to pines. So it's probably more beneficial to actually put this into a larger pot, even to develop a small size tree. And I'd say for most junipers, they'll actually benefit from being in larger pots compared to how you grow pines. But you can see the process is really simple with that reduction of sacrifice. I've just pruned enough to make sure the light's going in here. And additionally, what I can do is actually start to prune some of this with sugar on the inside if it's getting a little too long. So again, the idea is just to try and force the growth back to the centre where it's going to become that branching like that in the future. So one thing that obviously differs a lot with junipers compared to pines is we tend to put a lot of shari in junipers, and that's for two reasons. So number one, they can handle it, it looks good, such as this tree here. Number two, we can use the shari as a growing technique to actually speed up the thickening, but it's a fake thickening. So what I'm referring to there is, obviously a shari is a dead section of wood, so the growth starts to sort of, rather than going around and completely growing in all directions equally, it starts to grow in the direction where the growth is. If the shari is in the middle, it starts to grow out this way. If we put that shari on the front and the back, suddenly, instead of growing out into a big circle like this, the growth is almost squished down and it's starting to actually grow outwards in two very obvious directions. So what happens on a lot of junipers is we'll twist them up, we'll do these sharis, and the profile of the trees ends up looking like this. If you've ever seen ribbon junipers in Japan, they're really thick and they sort of twist up, but from the side they are like a sandwich. They're very skinny. The taper and the thickening is all deception. All that dead wood that we see like this from the side looks like that. The same technique can be applied in sort of 3 dimensions with all the twisting, and it just speeds up the fake thickness of the tree. The tree's not actually that thick, we force it to develop that thick. And we can achieve that really easy way by putting shari in both sides and widening that shari every single year. So letting the tree actually grow inwards, removing more living tissue a little bit further out from where we did the previous year, forcing the tree to grow in that very straight direction coming out this way. Same on the other side, coming out that way. So, one thing that we do with junipers is year on year on year, we do shari work every single year as part of the process.
When do you do the shari work?
So junipers, the best time to do it's actually autumn. So if we think about the way juniper grows, so obviously pines, most other conifers are putting all their growth in spring. They're really thickening throughout the entire season. Junipers, on the other hand, being quite mountainous, cold climate trees, they tend to put all their growth in winter. Sorry, in autumn, in preparation for a very cold winter. They're really thickening their vascular tissue in autumn, but to the point where if I put the shari in at the beginning of autumn, if that shari was only like a centimetre wide, it might close up within a month or two. They're just putting on the most amount of vascular tissue during that time of year. So as a result, autumn is the best time because the tree can recover really quickly. It doesn't have to deal with very hot climate that might dry up the candy and that might kill things. The climate is gentle, the weather is usually a bit more humid, and as a result, they put on a lot of tissue during that time. To the point where you think, is that caterpillar? Oh no, that's just green cambium that just popped up in the last week. So doing that work religiously every year, every single autumn, coming back and doing that and getting it again.
Do you have a tool preference for doing your sharis?
I don't really have a preference. I thought I brought it tonight though. I tend to use like a really small chisel to do my shari. So you can use like an X-Acto knife, works fine, but you just want something very sharp that you can just very slowly sort of cut the lines that you want. So an X-Acto knife, I use a really small chisel because I sort of like to, instead of say pulling down to do the cut, I sort of push in with the chisel, sort of following the path I would like. It's 2 things you want, is a really sharp small knife and then something to actually pick the cambium off and pull it. So what I tend to do is cut both sides of the shari channel that I want, get my little red sort of, it's almost like a dentist pick, and then get that under the tissue and then just pull it up. But making sure you do the cut first before I do the pull, because you only cut maybe the sides and you don't finish the cut on the top, and you can pull past where you intended to stop the shard. So it works really well for that first year when you're sort of establishing it. But I find the chisel works better in the second year because you can sort of come across, it sort of starts to roll over the previous deadwood. So it's actually very challenging to get a knife and do a cut. The chiseling is sort of pushing from one side and just sort of pick up the living tissue or get it up. So
How fast do you widen the shard?
it's only a few millimeters each year. So I start when the trees are probably not this young. Probably when the tree's getting about to a centimetre or a centimetre and a half in thickness. And then I'll just do a shari that's maybe 5 millimetres long, just that first year. So the idea of that first year is it doesn't have to be thick because you're just trying to dictate the tree needs to grow around the cut. And then year and year after that, like you might close over the first year, then you come back, you reopen it another 5 millimetres. The idea is that 5 millimetre gain that you do every year should hopefully equal to 5 millimetres of thickening. We do that consistently over 10 years. You'll have 5 centimetres worth of growth achieved on both sides. So yeah, it very quickly builds up steam and you end up with a very thick tree with a shorter amount of time compared to say waiting for it to thicken naturally.
Sorry, that was 5 mils on each side?
Yes, on each side. So,
Okay, fine.
so for instance, I do like 5 millimetres on this side and on the opposite side of the light vein, and then I'll come through and do it on the back side as well. So I take off. It's sort of 5 millimetres past where the previous cut was made, because you can see where the tree's rolled over. So it is you go 5 millimetres beyond where you cut last year into the existing tissue. So it's a very slow process, but is one that's essential for developing junipers, because this one was done a bit too quickly. So what happens is the deadwood doesn't have much detail if you do it too quickly. So what happens is you get the first year, obviously it rolls over, that's a new layer of cambium tissue on the deadwood. You cut it back, it rolls over again, that's the second layer. Doing that every single year, if you do it for 10 years, that's 10 layers of deadwood you have. And what you start to build is this very realistic looking deadwood. So maybe come up a bit later. This one's had about 3 years worth of that deadwood sort of cutting. But it looks more, it doesn't just look like one flat bit of wood, it looks like an actual bit of yellow story, where it's sort of rolled over and died back and rolled over and died back and rolled over and died back.
You put anything on the shari as soon as you run it, or you let it go?
Yeah, most of the time, like I'll occasionally put the putty cut face just on the living, like on the bit where the cambium's been cut. But doing it at autumn, you don't need to do anything to it. You can just leave it exposed and it'll just naturally settle to it. As if you've cut a little bit too far, it can help to put that little bit of putty just to be on the safe side. But yeah, if the weather's good in say March or early April, you don't need to really put much face. Okay, so same again with the pine is you just keep going. You just keep doing that shari work. You keep letting these get longer. Maybe if you get some new growth and you want to get some additional gins, you do a bit more twisting and compressing. And then you keep doing this work consistently, and you're just waiting until you're happy with that thickness. Whether that's another 5 years until it's a little tiny tree like this, another, I guess how old this one would have been to develop it this thick, about 15 years to get to this sort of thickness. But yeah, it's about that consistency of doing that work every year that gives you the result. And the good thing about junipers, you don't have to, it's good to have a size in mind, but you don't need any sort of design to the branching yet. You can purely just keep as many branches as possible. And when it comes time to actually style the tree, that's where you can decide, I like that as a gin, or actually maybe if I rotate it this way, and I'll gin this whole side, keep this whole side here. And this tree is a result of that. The fact we've got gins on one side and growth on the other side is very typical of junipers because of the way they grow. They look more dynamic like that. But as a result of, actually this gin here looks really nice, and if I kill off all of it, I can focus on that gin, and then develop my nice foliage pack here. So yeah, it's more fun because you can style the tree up, as opposed to these, like pines have grown into that form, junipers are sort of grown and then styled into that form. What questions are there?
Evan, have you found that with the way that the and your temperature is gradually creeping up. Is that how does that affect your timing on this? Does it give you more scope, or is it making it harder to time some things?
Yeah, for now it's not too bad. It's giving, well, I found less time to do things when they need to be done. So, for instance, with conifers, I tend to do all my work in the winter. It's been very short winter this year. It's probably going to start warming up next month to the point where maples are coming out into budburst. It means I haven't had enough downtime on the trees to sort of settle into winter, do a few dormant things for a few months, maybe do some wiring, do some trimming on them, before then letting them get further along in the process of growing in the spring. I think for me, I don't stick to a calendar. I'm very reactive to how I see my trees performing in the garden. So I sort of do things when they need to be done. For, I guess one example, I repot maples. I try to repot maples when I see the buds opening up. That's very variable. It could be 2 or 3 weeks difference each year. But I time it by going out every day and just seeing like, oh, it's the same open up, I'll do a repot this weekend. Let's go on the plants that are a bit more forgiving. You can do the work a little bit into the spring season, even the repotting if you're careful enough. But it's more, like for instance with the junipers, that timing of when I should be doing that shari work is a little bit more harder to tell. Like, I think we had a bad year this year where it was like really warm into quite late into March.
Not really.
Yeah, at least with like it was just trying to dictate like, oh, is it a bit too late to do that shari, or should I have done it a little bit earlier? Because again, we did have those really hot spells that just came out of nowhere.
If you have a look at our newsletter, I've been doing some charts off the bonds. I'm just doing it off Sydney there. But I've got one chart which is since their record started in 1859. Then I've got a 10-year chart, and the 10-year chart is uniformly about 1.5 degrees warmer than the full year thing. Yeah. And even with that burst of cold weather that we had, that was closer to our averages than being. So yeah, they've been really cold.
Yeah.
So like it's getting warmer all the time.
Like the one thing that's become clear is the one-off weather events where like we've had a few doozies this year, like hot spells in autumn and then cold snaps right after that. And that unpredictability has meant that I've had cherry blossoms starting to leaf out of season. For me, like the conifers are quite adaptable, but other things, it makes it challenging to predict when I should do things.
What is the ideal thing to repot pine, like ideal month to repot pine?
I think around now, like towards the end of winter. So even with pines, I'd be starting repotting now, and then maybe
Is it safe? Like, if I start now, let's say from now to August?
Yeah, I mean, it's very safe for pines. So, like one thing with pines is you don't want to touch the roots when you've got active growth at the top.
Okay.
Because what happens is if you suddenly root prune and you've got candles that are this long, those candles need a lot of water to maintain their turgor pressure. They can't get enough water from their root system. They haven't put on enough root growth yet. So doing it now allows the time, because the roots are actually going to start growing pretty much now-ish. Like if I take this out of the pot, I wouldn't be surprised if there's nice white fibrous roots down the bottom. Like temperatures are just warming up enough where it can put on root growth, but not hot enough where it's popping out growth on the top. So I find now's the best window to repots.
So by candle growth, it's before you see any candle growth, any buds?
Yeah, ideally before you see any sort of blade growth. Like when they're dormant is the best time. Any time after that is a little bit too late. For junipers, I found autumn is actually my favourite time to repot. So similar to how I said the cambium tissue really thickens up during the autumn. It's the same with root recovery, where if I do a repot and I cut the roots in autumn, they'll push on, like they tend to put their most root growth in autumn compared to the other seasons. So really it's only junipers that fall outside of that sort of window that's now, but most other conifers are doing it. Only other question?
With your junipers and you're keeping in that close foliage, are you trimming those back a little bit as well?
Yeah.
Just to make sure you're not getting super leggy growth.
Yeah, so I'll be pruning it. If they're getting a little bit too long, I'll actually cut the growing tips back. If it's getting a little bit too sort of crowded, I guess, I'll actually thin back this material growth. Like I might thin it out by half and then sort of try and get as much light as I can to let it back up a little bit. But ideally, yeah, you want to not be letting this get too thick or too full. If it gets too thick, you just cut the branch off or you jig it, or you wire it up and turn it into a sacrifice. Because you want really short growth to work with to then develop it like this, because particularly being shogun trees, you don't have much space to play with it. If the branch is 10 centimeters long, that's sometimes half the width of the tree. So yeah, you want to keep it tight, short, not overly full, and perfect for then when you do everything with your wire. So cool, I think that's about it. I'm happy to take more questions as well.
When you reduce the junipers and you got sacrifice branches, do you need to, like we were talking about in the pine, to reduce them slowly? Or
The good thing with junipers, so I'm probably should have mentioned like at the start with conifers. So conifers, they use tracheids. They don't have standard sort of vascular tissue where sort of water and nutrients can move sideways and go up and down. They have what they call tracheids, which are like these very defined channels that basically only move up and down. And so it results in evolution. They're very old, like not quite prehistoric, but they're much lower, so much further along in the evolutionary scale compared to say a maple or something like that. So it means, yeah, they can move water up and down, and they have trouble moving side to side. Which really shows in junipers where the reason we have this live vein, this living tissue, and the reason when we peel it off, it comes off in one straight ribbon, is because that's the tracheid. That's like a channel that goes from a root and directly goes all the way up the tree to a top bit. So obviously cambium tissue is a bit more flexible. It has maybe some of that growth that goes side to side. But the majority of the tissue is just very singular in terms of if I accidentally kill a root or a branch down here, you might get them die off on the opposite side. Like if a branch here dies, it might be a result of the root down here being an issue. Which means that we can kill off sacrifice tissue without compromising the rest of the tree, because that sacrifice tends to be linked to a part down lower on the tree. It shows in sometimes when you do shari work, where you might do a shari and that shari just dies all the way back to the root base. So yeah, that vascular tracheid system means that you can happily gin everything that you need to all in one hit, and it won't affect the tree's health at all. Like all these sacrifices here, I just gin them today and the rest of the tree will be healthy. Pines, on the other hand, are a bit different. Like the tracheids, they are to some extent there, but I think they're a bit more flexible in terms of the fact they have a sac system, and that's very dominant in the way that they maintain the turgor pressure means that they don't quite die off in the same way where if you lose a branch, you lose a big branch, you lose everything below it. But for small trees like this, it's not the case. Got any more questions? Or?
When you're eventually ready to cut off the sacrifice branch at that thickness, would you gin it, or that one? Would you gin it or flush cut it? What would you do with that?
Yeah, so that was a good point I forgot to mention. The sacrifice on the pine, we actually try and place in the back of the tree. So the idea is it's in the top of the tree and also towards the back, so we can actually hide it below the apex. It's in a place where people won't see it as clearly. And that's because usually when we remove the sacrifice, we don't want to gin it. It makes the tree taller than it should be. I guess the other side of the issue is it won't roll over completely. Pines are really slow, they don't, if you have a scar this big, it will never heal over, like maybe 100 years if you're lucky. But even for a tree this size, that scar will take a good 5 to 6 years to maybe start to be 80% of the way being healed up. But will always be there as a scar, and you'll never have a branch in that position. So by placing that sacrifice sort of in the back here, what we can do is we can bend foliage from the top over the top of that, and also have growth, like I've done with this one, have growth next to it that goes up, and basically is there to hide the fact that there's a big scar next to it. So all of the best shogun trees, like even the super famous ones in Japan, the nice and this one 50 years old, even the old ones, you turn them, so you look at them from above and you look at the back, you'll see immediately the scars on every single one. So yeah, it's a very important thing to try and highlight that. You know, I've done that on this tree. This will be the front because the sacrifice will be in the back. But then further up the tree you have it, the easier it is to hide. If it's too low, like if you have there's something I've seen some people do where they have the sacrifice that's almost at the soil level, like down here on the tree. It becomes a big gin or a big scar regardless. And they have 5 of them, and you suddenly have 5 big gins all in your face. Pines, like, it's nice to have some gins, but the character of the pine, and the reason they're the king and queen of bonsai, the black pine, the white pine, is because they're elegant and they don't have these big massive gins most of the time. So if you're trying to develop a tree of that character, you don't want big sacrifice scars or big gins down the bottom. You want them hidden away.
Evan, we were going to keep you all night, and I, for one, could listen to you for a lot longer. What it says is we're going to get you back. What do you think?
Hey, Evan, are you still doing those? You're doing camellias and miniature roses at one bonsai by the harbour, I think.
Yeah, so it's
Great time.
still growing those. Not as many, like I don't actively grow camellias and roses a lot.
Yeah.
But yeah, I still have a few. And
Yeah, because I went out hunting for tiny little camellias. I couldn't find it.
yeah, I'll try and crop it out. I've got a few that I've collected that are
Yeah.
quite small, but nothing
Yeah.
minuscule.
What he was doing effectively is doing the camellias and the little tiny little roses. What he just did to that tiny. It was good. Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm trying because I'm actually quite local. I'm only in Hurstville, so I really should try and get to this club more often. It's my local club. But again, yeah, thanks for having me. Mention quickly, so I'm part of the School of Bonsai, that's my main club where one of the teachers there. But yeah, we've managed to secure my teacher at Koji to come next year in March sometime. So we'll probably have a demonstration night of some sort, but I'll make sure to send an email around to your club as well.
We get your notification.
Oh yeah, perfect, yeah. So yeah, we'll probably will make an open thing to most of the other clubs. And yeah, it should be a good event, but yeah, I'm happy to come back here as well, anytime. So.
Evan, thank you once again, that was really great.
Thank you.
We look forward to the next time. We're quickly getting out of time. Chris has agreed to do a quick and dirty critique of the display trees. So how about we do that? And I've got the list of those people who want to go to Mount Wilson here. Please, please don't go without having your name so that we can get that information. Over to you, Chris.
Without a gin, and it's got plenty of gins. And the colour I like, it's just pop, maybe a bit big, but should be on the stand if you're going to show it. But I quite like it, it just appeals to me. This I particularly like. It's just a nice thing. It's elegant to me. And I'm going to listen a little bit. The stand and the top are nice. And to me that's really appealing. The foliage is nicely balanced, nice colour. Again, contains size. That appeals to me. And so does there's been obviously a massive amount of work put into this, judging by the amount of wire on it. We took it off, I think it should go boring. Kilo lighter. The stand, I quite like. The pipe is one of your synthetic pipes?
No, it's a rock. It's a real rock. It's actually a real rock.
What's the weapon stuff here?
Alright? It's master's tape,
Okay.
and I put some muck in there to hold the soil in.
You sure that's a real rock, Paul?
Yeah, lift it. See if you can lift it. Yeah, lift it.
Well, I can't lift it. Well,
Yeah. It's not a fake rock.
not a real rock either. I quite like it. It's it's got some serious trunk work on it. And I quite like it. This is mine. This is what I call my plastic tree. It does nothing. That's been like that for months. It doesn't do anything. I got the shits with it and had a lot of foliage, and I decided to take my inspiration from James, and I really got into it. And most of the tree ended up being a garbage tin. I still haven't got it right, but it's a silent juniper. It's about 20 years old, and it's developed that trunk in 20 years.
Is that it? Should I put it
It's
on?
nothing. It just sits there. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't die. It doesn't grow. It's just like plastic. It's incredibly slow growing. If you're after a tree, you've got to have a lot of patience. You're going to try one of these. I tend to try to, with junipers, is try to cut the foliage flat. Anything going up goes, anything going down goes. And fans, I think they look better that way. I don't know what, I'm still playing with this thing. I don't know where that's going. Couple of little pines here. Maybe the top's a little bit big. I like it. Got lots of movement in the trunk. The leaf, the needle size is a bit under control, a little bit more work there, I reckon. But I quite like the tree itself. It's got a nice sort of conical shape to me. This little fella, again, I like his stand. Not wrapped in that stand, sorry Simon. I quite like these sort of slabby type things. To me, maybe a little bit too much growth on coming from me. But I do, you know, it's a juniper and I like it in. And I quite like the tree itself. Maybe it needs just a little bit more, not such a ball. That's it.
Thank you. It's been a pretty full meeting tonight, so thank you for persevering and your patience. Please, we'll have to wrap up soon so we can get out here. Please don't forget to sign your name on the person sheet. And I'll see you next month.
Oh, you could do it.